Some of my clearest, though certainly not my fondest, memories of my childhood were these 30-minute car rides to and from after-school activities, usually to a music lesson or a softball game, or every once in a while on the rare occasion to see a Braves game. I spent hours in the car with my father on most weeks, in which we would traverse as many as 3 whole miles on our journey through Atlanta's rush hour traffic, which began at 3 o'clock and spanned until 8 or so. And during most of these drives, we listened to the wisdom of Clark Howard, the consumer expert and the financial guru, on the AM radio. And as much as I complained, as much as I was bored into complicity or often a nap by the monotony of Clark Howard's voice, I learned a lot on those 30-minute drives. He always called, for instance, Clark Howard always called debit cards fake credit cards. And to this day, I still don't use a debit card. Clark Howard preached tirelessly about the importance of saving for retirement. And I still contribute to the Roth IRA that my dad started for me as an Easter gift when I was like 14 years old. That was the end to the fun of Easter. I learned about interest rates. I learned about the importance of checking my credit score before I really even had one. During those long car rides every afternoon, I was learning how to save for the future. And now, as Stephen and I prepare to get married next month, we talk about finances still. In fact, it's something that I think every couple should talk about before marriage. I imagine that my colleagues agree. Stephen and I talk about how we're going to deal with money. We talk about how we're going to spend and budget, how we're going to invest and save, because we need to be on the same page about that. And I think it's really important because how we choose to live our lives matters. And it matters much more than more than the two of us. We want to save, we want to provide for our family, we want to be able to have a little fun, and we want to be able to give to the causes that matter to us. And so we are constantly trying to decide what is enough. And we are constantly trying to figure out how we know when we've gotten to enough. What are our realistic goals for the short term, and what do we want for the long term? What do we need to save for a rainy day, and how much do we need far in the future? And what do we need to achieve our goals? We're trying to figure it out. And I'm positive that we are not always succeeding, because figuring these things out isn't always easy. You all know that. Most of our experiences, after all, scream that you will never have enough. Our experiences, our culture screams at us that we always need more. Most of the things in our lives tell us that our worth is based on the things that we have, that our success in life is based on the money and the stuff that we have accumulated. That's what we have to show for our success. While it's important to plan for the future, if you're able, there's a difference between planning for the future and being selfish and greedy. And the consumeristic culture that we live in, if we aren't careful, can be detrimental to our own well-being and the well-being of our neighbors. It can put us in a delicate emotional state in which we begin to believe that our worth as a human being is based on the balance of our savings account. It puts us in this emotional state where we begin to believe that where we have come from or what we have accomplished defines who we are. We live in a world where in one place there are people who have a yacht large enough to hold a boat and a helicopter inside of it, yet in another place, children die every day of starvation. And we are constantly tricked into thinking that we need more. A better status, a bigger house, a fancier car, a new pair of shoes that we'll wear one time. And all the while, we are trying to get more. We quickly fall into this place where we begin to think only of ourselves. But that isn't the message that Jesus has for us. The message that Jesus has for us is that we are enough just as we are. The message Jesus has for us is that our wealth and our possessions, they don't define us, because God defines us. Jesus has a message for us this morning that we live an abundant life because we have God. Yet we often act like we live in a place of scarcity. We live with this constant fear of not having enough or not being enough, where our own self-interest begin to dictate all of our actions, and where nothing will ever be enough. And we become afraid that what we do have will be snatched away at the drop of a hat. And this fear, well, it can very easily take over our lives. It causes us to stockpile. We keep accumulating all of this stuff that we don't need, and we shun others who we think might try to take some of our power or our status. We place all of our trust in these material objects and the retention of whatever small amount of power we perceive ourselves to have. And then we pull it all so close to ourselves that it begins to block everything out, including the abundance of God's love for each of us. But that is not the life that God intends for us. That isn't the life that God provides for us. As all of that other stuff becomes our God, life stops being about Jesus. It stops being about our relationships with God and with others, and it becomes more about this earthly wealth that we can accumulate during our short time on earth. Wealth and power that will eventually just waste away. And that's not the message that Jesus has for us this morning. The message that Jesus has for us this morning is that we are loved abundantly, more than we could ever imagine and more than we could ever deserve. When Jesus tells that person in the crowd to be careful of all kinds of greed in our gospel this morning, he's reminding him that life doesn't consist of the abundance of possessions. He's telling the crowd, he's telling us to be careful, because enough is enough. And he tells them about this rich fool, a man who has more than he could ever need and who, through greed and selfishness, wants to keep it all for himself, even though in the end all of that grain will waste away before the man ever gets a chance to use it. Now, this is not a story of a farmer who has nothing and then finally has a little bit more than enough, so he wanted to store some up for the future. It's not about that. This story is about a man who already had plenty. He had barns already. He had plenty of room to store his grain and goods already, but he lived in a place of scarcity, where his only way to gain more comfort was to have even more, where his only way to feel secure was to store more than he could ever need. And Jesus is saying to the crowd, you're concentrating on the wrong stuff. Because instead of placing his trust in God, the rich fool placed all of his trust, all of his worth in material things. He placed it in his grain and his money and his status. And that need to have more stuff began to rule his life. He got stuck in a scarcity mindset, and that made him impervious to the abundance that God was promising him. This morning, I was talking to Christy last week, and she was telling me that this morning our children in Children's Chapel and Sunday School are talking about Pharaoh when he sends out a decree to kill all of the baby boys. It's the same idea there. Pharaoh is living into the fear of scarcity. He's living into the fear that something, in his case, power and control, right, will be taken away from him. Pharaoh is worried solely about himself and about retaining his wealth and his status as a ruler, and that blinds him. And then out of that mindset of scarcity, of never having enough, he makes a cruel order out of greed. And we sit here this morning and we think we would never do something like that. That we would never let our own fears lead us to do something horrible. But it happens all the time. Maybe not in quite that grand of a scale, but we let our fear of not having enough rule our lives. We let the false idea that for someone else to have something takes away from us, we let that rule our lives. And we let our desire to always have more blind us from the true needs of our neighbors. We seek shelter and safety in our own life, and we often put the safety and happiness of others behind our own. We fall into that mindset of scarcity too, instead of living a life out of abundance. But I know that we are fully capable of reorienting our priorities. We can reorient those priorities away from ourselves and toward God. I believe that if we work on it, we can move away from this desire to have more power and money than we really need, and instead turn toward the desire to help fulfill God's mission on the earth for all of God's children. We can turn away from our own self-interest and instead focus on the well-being of others. Because all of the stuff in our lives is not the abundance that God promises us. The abundance that comes from God is so much more. It's about grace and love, the abundance of mercy, and the promise of life everlasting. God promises an abundance that is for all people, each one of us and all of our neighbors too. So what if out of the abundance that God gives us, what if we try to start shifting from wanting more just for ourselves? What if we shift to wanting more for the whole world? What if we take the abundance of grace that we are reminded of every time we come to this communion table? What if we take this love manifest in Jesus Christ, and what if we do a better job of taking it out into the world around us, focusing on the abundance of love through Christ, none of which could ever go to waste? Because in God, there is plenty to go around. There's plenty of love. There's plenty of mercy. And there's all the grace that we could ever need. That is the abundance that God calls us to live into. And God's promise is one that we can put all of our trust in. Because through God, we receive the promise that our true safety, our true security, all of the promises of abundance, all of that lies in God. Amen.
Amen.